In this lecture, we will develop an algorithm which will update the DOM only in places where it actually changed. And remember that that is necessary because right now, as we update the servings here, then that will always basically re-render the entire recipe view here, right? And so we can see some flickering around the page. Well, right now it's not really happening for some reason, but you saw that in the previous video where every time that I would update the servings, it would then basically reload this image, which would then cause a short flicker. And having to re-render the entire view, so all of these HTML elements, is actually a bit overkill, and it will put too much strain on the browser. So it will create unnecessary work, and so therefore let's now create an update method that we can use in this situation. All right. So again, here instead of calling the render method, we actually want to be able to call an update method. So let's duplicate this line here or comment it. And so here we want to call update. And of course, the update will still need all the data, just like the render method. But again, the difference between update and render is that the update method will basically only update text and attributes in the DOM, so without having to re-render the entire view. And so let's now go to the view here, because we will want this update method to be available on all the views. Because actually we will use this in multiple situations in this project. So actually not just here for updating the servings. But anyway, this is called update and it receives also some data. Here then let's get this same check here. And also we will want to do these two parts. And that is because, well, once we update the data, we then want the views data to become that new data. And we also want to generate some new markup. So let's actually call this here the new markup. And this will basically be the entire markup as if we wanted to render a new view. But again, here we are just going to update the markup. But for doing that, we still need the entire markup so that we can then compare it to the old markup, basically. So again, what we will do here in this method is to create new markup, but not render it. So instead, all that we're going to do is to generate this markup and then compare that new HTML to the current HTML, and then only change text and attributes that actually have changed from the old version to the new version. Okay? So here we now have the markup, but that is just a string. And so that is going to be very difficult to compare to the DOM elements that we currently have on the page. And so to fix that problem, we can actually use a nice trick, which is to basically convert this markup string to a DOM object that's living in the memory and that we can then use to compare with the actual DOM that's on the page. So let's do that and create new DOM. And so document, and then we need to call a function called createRange. Okay, so this will create something called a range, and on the range we can then call yet another method, which is called createContextualFragment. And so this is where we then pass in the string of markup, so like a string of HTML. And so as I said before, this method will then convert that string into real DOM node objects. So basically, new DOM here will become like a big object, which is like a virtual DOM. So a DOM that is not really living on the page, but which lives in our memory. And so we can now use that DOM as if it was the real DOM on our page. And so we can do something like this. We can say new elements, and then we can take that new DOM, and then on that we can call query selector all and select all the elements in there. And so if we now log this to the console, then we will basically see all the elements that will be contained inside of this new DOM element that we basically created from generating the new markup for the updated data. Okay? So that sounds confusing, I'm sure, but we will see it in practice really soon. So we are calling update here, and so that will then trigger all of this. And so let's now see in the console what happens. So just to make sure everything works here. So as we're clicking here, it will of course now no longer update the values here in the DOM, because we are now using the update method, which for now doesn't do that. Okay, but what we did get was the entire list of all the elements in the new DOM. So in this, so to say, virtual DOM. Okay, so if we check now this element, so this is the element that contains the number, that should now contain 5. So let's see, the text content property or inner HTML is the same. And so indeed, here we have 5 now. And so again, the reason for that is that this here is now basically the DOM that would be rendered on the page if we simply used the render method from before. Okay? And so now with this, we can compare this DOM that we have here, which is a little bit like a virtual DOM, so to the actual DOM that is really on the page. So for example, again, this one here has now changed to 5, and this one is still at 4. And so that is one of the elements which is different, and so that is then one of the things that will change. But everything else is the same, or at least most of the things. For example, here the minutes, this value here, this is of course still 45. So you see, of course, it's still 45, and so this element will not change. And the same, for example, for the image, and for this icon, and for lots of things here. And so with this, we will be able to only change what happened from the new DOM, which is this one here, to the actual current DOM, which is basically what we have here on the page. So, in order to being able to actually do that comparison, we now also need to get all the actual elements that are currently on the page. So get them into our code. And so therefore, let's also select them. So let's call that the current elements, which are at this dot parent element, and then query selector all, and then again selecting all of them. And maybe you saw previously that this here returned a node list, and so let's right away convert this and this one to a real array. So remember, we can do that with array.from. All right. And so let's actually now do that comparison. Well, I mean, only visually in the console for now. So let's log the current elements, and let's also again log the new elements. So let's click here now, and you see that now it is actually an array. Okay. So let's look again for this servings, and that's actually not the one. No, this is the one. So let's see the text content or the inner HTML. And so indeed, it is still 4, right? And again, because that is the current DOM. But if we now come to our new DOM, then, well, it's got to be down here. So then, if we open up this one, then again, we should be already at 5. right? So here we have 5. And so now let's actually compare these two basically one by one. Okay, so I'm going to loop over the new elements array now. And here in the callback function, then the current element is the new L, let's say. And then we also need access to the current index so that we can then also grab the current element from this array. So basically, we need to loop over the two arrays at the same time. And I think we've done that before. So for that, we also need the index so that now we can say that the current element is equal current elements at position I. Okay. And now, how will we actually compare these two elements? So current element and new element. Well, there's actually a very handy method that is available on all nodes, which is equal node. So let's log that here to the console. So in each iteration, we will log whether the new element is equal node to the current element. And then let's disable these two console.logs here. And let's also log the current element so that we actually know what elements we are comparing here. All right. So again, this method here will basically compare the content of this one and of this one. So it doesn't have to be the exact same node. All that matters is that the content in these nodes is the same. Right? And if you're curious about the difference between elements and nodes, then please go watch the beginning of the Advanced DOM section, because there is a very nice lecture about that. Okay? But anyway, let's now check this. So clearing this. And so a lot of things happened here. And so you see that most of these nodes are actually the same. Let's go all the way to the top here. So these here are all the same, so you see true, but here you also see false. So basically this entire container is not the same as before because something inside of there changed. But let's actually go to that detail. So here it is. So here this is now false because this current element here is now different from the new element, which will have 5 servings. And the same here for these two buttons. So this button and also this button, because this data attribute in there will also be different. So if we are on page 5, then this here will update to 6 and this one to 4. Okay? So again, we have this to false because the current element is at this point different from the new element. But the same also happens on all the parent elements of that. So it happens here in recipe info, and then, as we saw previously, also in this whole container. Simply because the 4 in there changed, and so that means that this entire container is of course different to what it was before. But never mind about that for now, that's the detail we will tackle later. For now, let's use this knowledge here for our advantage and do something in this situation. So, basically, if the new element is equal to the current element, so if that is not the case, so if they are different, then we want to change the text content of the current element to the text content of the new element. Right? And so this essentially is updating the DOM only in places where it has changed, or where it was about to change. So current element.text content, and remember that this current element is the actual element that is currently on the page. And so that is the one that we want to update, so to mutate. And its text content should be the same as the new element dot text content. However, now we will get a problem, as you will see. So let's click here. And indeed, some replacement was done. So you see we now have 5 servings. But again, the problem here is that we now basically replaced the entire container here. Because here there was already some change. And so then right away, the entire text content from this parent element was taken and replaced. And so of course, this doesn't work. So instead of what we're doing right now, we now need to find a way of determining if the element only contains text, because that is the only thing that we want to replace. So again, what we want to replace is only this one here, because this here contains only text. Okay? So how can we do that? Well, there is yet another very nice method, or actually property, that is available on all nodes. And let me actually show that to you on the MDN documentation. And it is called node value. So this is the one. And so the value of node value will be null if the node is an element, or really most of these things. But if it is text, then we actually get the content of the text node. And so we can now use this to our advantage. So besides checking for this, we can now also do another check. So of course the elements still need to be different, but now we only want elements that are actually text. So this is how we can do it. So new element, and now we need to select the child node. So let's take the first child, which remember will return a node, as we learned also in that advanced DOM section. And we need to select the child because the child node is actually what contains the text, right? So the element is really just an element. It is an element node and not a text node. And so what is in fact the text is the first child node. And again, we talked about that in the advanced DOM section, which I hope you remember. And so now we can take the node value here. And so if this is text, this will then be some kind of text here. And so this text should not be empty. So different from an empty string. And actually, let's also trim any white space here. Okay. And so with this, it should work. But I'm sure this is, again, a little bit confusing. So let's actually log this value here to the console. Okay. Just so you see what this will actually be. And let's log this together with some emoji, just so we can see it in the console different from all the other logs. So by now this should actually already been working, but I want to focus for now only on the log. So you see it already did work here, but let's now go to our logs and all the way to the top. So this here has the explosion, so it's the log we are interested in. And so indeed, it just got the text here out of this element, right? So this was the current element in the loop. And so then at this point, the first child.node value is 5. And again, in all other elements which do not contain text directly, this node value will be null. And so therefore, then this whole expression here will be false. And so then this replacement here does not take place. Now here, let's just add some optional chaining because the first child might not always exist. So with this, we make 100% sure that this code is going to work. So let's check it out again here. And so if we click on minus now, you see that only this value is replaced and also these values here, but you don't see any of the flickering or any other weird effects here because there is nothing else that is being replaced. It's only really this text. Everything else is staying the same. And so that is exactly what we wanted to achieve with this algorithm. Now, as you noticed, as I click here, the only options I have is to go to 3 servings and to 5 servings. And the reason for that is that right now we are not replacing yet the attributes here on these buttons. So they are still at 3 and 5. Let's check that here. So indeed, we still get 3 and 5, because all we did yet was to update the text, but not attributes. So whenever an element changes, we also want to change the attributes. So let's quickly do that here as well. And this we can actually not do here in this if block, because the condition that we created here makes it so that this code is only executed on elements that contain text directly, right? So that was the whole point of this line of code that I explained like over the last 5 minutes or so. And so instead, we only want to change the attributes when the new element is different from the old one or the current one. Okay, so let's just comment this here. Updates changed text, and then here we want to update changed attributes. Now here there's something cool that we can use. So yet another new thing, which is the attributes property on an element. So let's start by logging that to the console this time. So let's say new element dot attributes. And let's get rid of this console.log here now. And so for now, what this will do is to log this attributes property of all the elements that have changed. So let's see. Well, we still get a lot of different logs here, but that doesn't matter. So here we have, for example, this ingredient here. And so this has changed. And so here we then get a list of all the attributes. So we have the class, we have the length. So let's see here what that actually is. Well, but this one doesn't really matter. The one I'm interested in is actually the one on the buttons. So let's go up a little bit further. And this is the one, right? So here we have the actual attributes. So data update 2, and probably they should have the values also somewhere in there. So this is a lot of stuff. We don't need to take a look at this. So this is very confusing. But I just wanted to show that basically this here will return something like an object of all the attributes that have changed. So let's now convert this object here to an array, and then we can loop over this array and basically copy all the attributes from one element to the other element. So from the new element basically to the current one. So basically doing something similar as we did here with the text. So we want to loop over new element dot attributes, and again we need to convert that to an array like this. And then for each of them, so each is an attribute. And then on the current element, we want to set the attribute. So remember this method from way back, set attribute, which again we learned about in the advanced DOM section. And so here we want to take the name of the attribute and the value. Okay? And maybe just to make this a bit more clear, so right now this kind of comes out of nowhere. So let's also log this to the console so we can see what we're actually looping over here. So let's go back. And so here is that array. And so here we have the class, and data update 2. And so now let me actually show you the name. So that is the name, and let's do it for data update 2, which is the one we are actually interested in. So we will take that name and set it to the value, which is 4. So we will get that value and set it into the current element. Okay? So we don't need these curly braces anymore. And so again, basically what we are doing here is to simply replace all the attributes in the current element by the attributes coming from the new element. And so this will then replace the 5 that is currently here with 6. And so now we are able to go as far as we want here. All right. And so we successfully implemented a method for updating the DOM only in places where the text or the attributes actually changed. Now this algorithm here is probably not the most robust one, and so maybe it might not be the best algorithm to really use in the real world, unless you have like a kind of small application like this one. But for a really huge application, probably this algorithm is not performant enough and might not be good enough. But here in this project, I think that this was an excellent exercise to get even more familiar with some of the lower level details of the DOM, and also to think logically a little bit about what we wanted to achieve here. And so again, I hope that you liked this kind of small exercise, which was a little bit different from the rest of the project. And this was actually one of the more difficult parts for me to also figure out when I was building this project. And so I hope that you can go over this code one more time by yourself and really figure out exactly what is happening here. So let's check out our flowchart here on page 2, or actually part 2. And so we successfully just did this part here. Now, I also want to use this algorithm that we just developed to quickly tackle this part here of the application, which is to mark the selected result in the search results. So let me show that to you in practice. So here in the demo, whenever I select one of the recipes, it will then get this selected class here, right? And so then when I move out the mouse, it will stay selected. And so that's a nice touch that we are currently still missing here, right? So of course it doesn't stay selected. And so we can now use this update algorithm in order to update this entire search results view whenever we click on one of these results. And so let's go implement that. And we actually need to start with the view here. So search view, or actually results view, because this is where we need the logic of marking the current recipe as selected here. So the link that is selected will get a special class here. Let me show that to you here in the results. And so that is this one here. So preview link active. And so here we want to give that class to this anchor element here if this result ID is basically the same as the current ID in the URL. Okay, so let's start by determining that ID. And so remember, that is at window.location.hash. And then we want to take everything except the first element. So basically starting to read from the first element. Okay, and now here we want to conditionally add that class. So we can write a simple template literal here. And I'm right away putting the class here. And so here we want to say, if the result ID is the same as the current ID, then the result of this expression should become this class name. And otherwise, then simply an empty string. All right. And so now here in the controller, so the controller for the results, so search results, or actually in this one here, so the one controlling the recipes. So here we now want to update the results view. And let's do that right at the beginning, right here. Let's say 0 results view to mark selected search result. And so that's going to be results view dot update. And then here we want to pass in the current page. And so remember, that is model dot get search results page. Okay, so basically we are doing here exactly the same as this here, but instead of using render, we use update. Okay, now it would also work with render, and let's first see that. So let's search for something here. So pizza. And now I will click on this one here. And you see that it stays selected. And that happened because as the hash here changed, remember, then this recipe got loaded. And also, as we just did, this entire search results view got rendered again. And then this time, the ID of this result is the same as this one. And so therefore, it got that active class. Right? But watch what happens to all these images when I click, for example, this recipe here. So you see, like before, there is this flickering because everything is re-rendered. And so these images are basically loading again. And that is the whole reason why we have now the update method. And so with this, we will now fix that problem. So pizza again, and you see that already it did select the recipe that is currently active. Okay, and now you see that there is no flickering because now only the element that actually changed was updated. Great. Now I just noticed that when we reload the page, then we get no recipes found right here. And the reason for that is that our application is immediately trying to update this view here. So when the page loads and there is an ID, then it will of course immediately load that recipe, right? Even if there was no search before. And so then here, as we are trying to update, of course, there are no search results. And so this here will then return an empty array. And so let's go to our update method here. And here we can then remove this check. So again, right now we are calling update with an empty array. So data is this empty array. And so therefore this part will then be true and then this error gets rendered. And this doesn't make sense. So let's remove that. And so now that error is gone. And now immediately this one here gets selected. And so everything keeps working the same. All right. So we just did a big step towards improving our application even more and making it even more user-friendly. And it was a lot of work, but I really hope that it was worth it for you. And with that being said, let's now move on to the next feature, which will be to implement bookmarks.